Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Anya Prusa, the Slater Family Fellow and Senior Associate at the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute. The last 6 months have been one headline after another for Brazil, from the devastating impact of the pandemic to former President Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva's return to politics and potentially to the 2022 presidential race. But 2022 is still a long ways off, and there are a number of pressing challenges facing Brazil in the coming weeks and months. COVID-19 looms large. More than 470,000 Brazilians have already died from the virus, and the country is bracing for a third wave. There is an ongoing congressional inquiry into the government's handling of the pandemic, which I'm sure we will discuss today. But there are also questions about the economy as inflation rises and unemployment remains high, and whether the Brazilian Congress will manage to pass any reform measures this year. And there are questions about governability and politics, and President Bolsonaro's relationships with the Congress and the military. It's a complicated moment in Brazil. Joining me today to help us understand and to explain what's been going on and what the implications are for Brazil's political and economic future are three experts who have been closely following developments in Brasilia. It is my pleasure to introduce Julia Esmaioto, Managing Partner at Patri. Julia, it's a real pleasure to have you here. And Chris Garman, the Managing Director for the Americas at the Eurasia Group. Chris, glad you could be with us as well. And last, Claudio Couto, who heads the Professional Master's Program in Management and Public Policy at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Claudia, thanks for joining us as well.
Thanks, Amy.
I am going to start by asking our three speakers to give us their take on what's going on in Brazil, and then we're going to move to a Q&A session. For all of you joining us online, you can submit questions for our panel either by email to brazil@wilsoncenter.org, and that's Brazil with a Z, or on Twitter @BrazilInst. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julia.
Thanks, Anya. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here along with Christopher and Claudia today. I have a couple of topics that I want to bring up to kick off our conversation regarding the current Brazilian landscape. The pandemic deepened the gap of social inequality in Brazil, which was already large to begin with. COVID has been hitting the country hard, which ranks second only to the United States in number of deaths and is third in number of cases globally. To make things worse, a third wave is expected, and it's still uncertain when the majority of the population will be fully vaccinated. On the economic front, 22 wasn't so bad in light of this scenario, nor should it be so bad in 2021, but the economic recovery will be significantly slower than other countries with better vaccination rollout. Markets and the federal government are excited about short-term perspectives for public revenues and economic activity as a whole. Most confidence indexes are surging, the stock market has been breaking positive records, and GDP figures for the first quarter had over 1% growth compared to the previous quarter. On the other hand, Brazil has a tight budget to carry out actions in response to the economic and health crisis. The public debt to GDP ratio is still very high, there's rising inflation, and the imminent water crisis is expected to last until November, which affects power generation, water supply, and agribusiness. Furthermore, Brazil faces dire social figures with the unemployment rate hitting 15%, while the number of Brazilians in extreme poverty has reached a historic record of 14 million people. For the first time in 17 years, more than half of the population, which means more than 100 million people, face food insecurity. In this context, it's still crucial for the country to pass structural reforms. Regarding tax reform, it will be hard to pass a comprehensive reform like the constitutional amendment currently in the Senate, considering the economic and health scenarios, as well as the elections approaching next year. There's a consensus on the need to simplify the tax system, but there are many different opinions on how the reform scope should look. That is why a segmented tax reform has many more chances to really progress in Congress. At the same time, the administrative reform has been progressing in the House, but it's less likely to be voted on by the end of next year. The Senate committee investigating whether or not the administration could be held accountable for public health mistakes during the pandemic will likely dominate the Congress agenda until at least October. However, there's still room for lawmakers to discuss and approve other key measures, such as Eletrobras privatization, legal framework of the exchange market, environmental licensing, among others. The dramatic effects of the pandemic, along with the vaccination rollout, are some of the reasons we've seen the president's approval ratings fall in all public opinion polls released in the last few weeks. However, the administration still has room to take action regarding vaccination and other issues, such as the extension of the cash transfer program, and with that, see positive effects in its public approval ratings. Regardless of this, Bolsonaro's actions in downplaying the pandemic left a void that has been filled by Congress, the Supreme Court, and other political leaders at state and local levels. And as we move forward, the COVID crisis and presidential elections are likely to heighten political tensions. In addition to that, protesters have taken to the streets. The demonstrations we've seen this past week are likely to continue, putting even more pressure on the government. On the international stage, pressure mounts regarding environmental issues and for Brazil to demonstrate concrete results in curbing illegal deforestation in the Amazon region, which could end up with the Minister of Environment being dismissed. All of this, of course, has been a concern for Bolsonaro regarding his re-election next year. On top of all that, there's also the key factor of former President Lula's comeback to the electoral arena, which shakes up the political landscape even more. In this context, the economic recovery and progress of the structural agenda will be crucial to determine political alliances in 2022 and the government's success in the election. From the perspective of policy, the bottom line is there's still a possible agenda to be approved before the elections to improve Brazilian regulatory environment and help the country recover more quickly. And with that, I turn it over to you, Anya. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia. Chris, I'm going to come next to you to hear your thoughts on, what have been the most significant political developments and where is Brazil headed?
Thank you very much, Anya. Real pleasure to be able to be here and join this conversation. Delighted to have this panel with both Julia and Claudio. It's always great to have such a high quality group to discuss the environment in Brazil. I mean, listen, what I would say is, at the get-go, of course, you look at the headlines in Brazil over the past year, they've been nothing short of horrendous, right? We've had a president who has, been, let's say, tremendously and fairly criticized over the management of COVID, minimizing, its severity and repercussions, making outlandish comments, not defending social isolation, standing against lockdowns. The pandemic has been suffering because of that, very slow on the vaccine rollout. You look at kind of Brazil's fiscal picture is coming out of COVID more precarious. Financial markets have reacted, very nervously to the potential signs of fiscal mismanagement. And you look at Brazil in comparison to many other emerging markets, I would say that it's probably one of the countries that has taken the largest credibility hit vis-a-vis its peers. But I'd like to make the case that the facts on the ground and the policy environment isn't as bad as the headlines would suggest. I'm less concerned about the policy environment over the next 6 to 8 months, but I am more concerned about what we're headed towards in next year's election, right? So let me kind of justify, that initial statement. First, when kind of backing up the assertion that ultimately what we're seeing in Brazil, that the facts on the ground aren't as bad as the headlines suggest, it's important to look at Brazil in the comparative context in Latin America, right? Let's look at what's happening in the region right now. What we're seeing, if you look at the politics in Latin America, we have President Ivan Duque, who put forward a proposal for a tax reform to allocate more spending on social programs, but also to raise a tax burden to generate some fiscal savings. Facing massive protests, he had to back down immediately after 1 week. His Minister of Economy lost the job. That reform is going nowhere. We have a an election outcome in Peru with a radical leftist candidate, Castillo, looks like he's going to come on top of, the kind of the right-wing candidate, Keiko Fujimori. We have a constitutional assembly election in Chile where all the center-right and center-left parties came out losing, kind of this blog of independence, kind of against the establishment coming out on top, right? So you look at kind of the politics in the region, what we're seeing ultimately is a social and political environment where the political scar tissues of COVID-19 are coming to roost in 2021, right? A lot of the governments in the region kind of ended up spending during the COVID crisis. Approval ratings didn't drop all that much, but you look at the trajectory of economic recovery, it's more unequal. A lot of the public frustrations and anger that we saw prior to COVID are being exacerbated in a context where governments don't have more money to be able to spend, right? So, and the region has been hit hard, okay? So I would say that any look at Brazil has to be nestled within a broader context where the entire region is feeling the economic and political repercussions of COVID-19 in a context where governments have less room to spend heading into the second year of the pandemic. So if you look at Brazil by that metric, I wouldn't say that Brazil is kind of worse than the region. In fact, I can make the opposite case, that actually on a relative basis, it may be even better. A quick few data points just to illustrate the point. Yes, Brazil has the second highest death count on a nominal basis, but you look at the death count on a populational basis, right? On a kind of per capita basis, by the end of 2020, Brazil's death count was equivalent, very close to the average of the entire South America. It wasn't much higher than the rest of their peers, right? So we have governments that had severe lockdowns, like Argentina, and Brazil was very lax. But by the end of last year, they landed almost in the same place. Brazil kind of took off with the second wave of the pandemic, but look at Argentina, look at Colombia. They're facing second waves of the pandemic right now. So I would make the case that from an epidemiological facts on the ground, there's more convergence in Latin America than divergence, right? Which I think kind of suggests that, independent of the mismanagement of Bolsonaro, which was evident, that the outcomes don't look all that different, point number one. Point number two, you look at kind of the capacity of the economic team to be able to manage pressures for more spending coming out of this. They're coming with, certain reputational scar tissues, yes, but the economic team is doing a reasonably good job of reducing the amount of spending in the second year of this pandemic. The total amount of spending outside of the constitutional cap on spending will be much smaller than it was last year. Market fears that the Bolsonaro would turn populist and spend his way to re-election have not proven to be correct. I think that the rally in asset prices that we're seeing over the past month are kind of reflect this growing recognition that we're not heading into a crisis of governability and fiscal mismanagement coming out of the pandemic, right? And so I think that some of the concerns were overstated. Number three, I would look at kind of, the notion that reforms have come to a standstill in Brazil. That's just not the case. It's actually, you look at kind of everything that has been approved in the year of the pandemic. Let me list the reforms that were approved. An opening of the sanitation sector that allows for privatization of state-owned sanitation companies last year. You have a new bankruptcy law that was approved at the end of the year. A new law that kind of allows for the bailout of state and local governments under stricter conditions, which was called the so-called Plano Mansueto law. Central bank, the formal autonomy of the central bank. A new regulatory framework to facilitate private investments in the distribution of gas. Congress is about to approve the privatization of Eletrobras. A slimmed down tax reform that Julia talked about, I think I also agree, some version of that is likely to come. Or, less likely, but still in play, an administrative reform. A lot of pundits were saying this is very little in comparison to the challenges that Brazil faces. There's no near-term fiscal adjustment. But I look at that track record and say, in the context of the Latin America context I just described, not that bad, right? So I think that the issue is, how do you compare this to? And I think that part of the explanation is, we have an administration which is highly polarizing. It generates tremendous conflict. A public, turned against the president over the management of COVID. He's paying a price politically for it. But there's an interesting kind of consensus for reforms in Congress that allows these this agenda to move despite all this tremendous noise and polarized politics that's consuming the media narrative, right? So you look at kind of fiscal management reforms and the actual damage, epidemiological facts on the ground, you look, compare Brazil to Latin America, it doesn't look all that bad. Now, the second message here, and I'll close here just to be very succinct, is when we looked at the presidential election next year, we're headed towards a highly polarized environment, much like the rest of the region. I don't see much room for a centrist candidate to emerge to be competitive between Bolsonaro and Lula. I think both candidates are going to be very strong. I think people are underappreciating Bolsonaro's political capital. I think it's going to be a very, very tight election. Hard to handicap who's going to come out on top. I do think that, in a year from now, with a good chunk of the population vaccinated, and by the way, Brazil's vaccination rates in Latin America, outside of Chile and Uruguay, looks fairly decent. I mean, it's actually probably third in the region in terms of vaccination per capita outside of Chile and Uruguay. And we should be well advanced, looking at the second half of the year. So with a good chunk of the population vaccinated, Bolsonaro, he should recover in the polls in the second half of the year. So I think it's going to be very, very close. But what I'm less optimistic about is the reform prospects coming out of this election in 2023. I think it's going to be a tough environment for reforms independent of who wins, and obviously some overshooting on the size of the risks for either of those scenarios. But we can talk about that in Q&A.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to hear a perspective that isn't quite so negative. I think we can get lost in the fact that all the headlines, right, point to the challenges that Brazil is facing and overlook some of the progress that is being made. Claudio, I'm going to turn it over to you now for your comments, on the policy and the political environment, and if you want to reflect as well on what Julia and Chris have said.
Okay, thank you, Anya. It's a pleasure to be here with Julia, with Chris. Chris is a very old friend, more friend than old, actually. And well, I think that he's a bit more optimistic than I am about the Brazilian perspectives. And why that? Just to start to talk about this, I'll take into consideration one point that is being raised all the time in Brazil, in Brazilian debates, mostly among political scientists and some political journalists. That is, are our political institutions working or not? Are they functional or not? It is somewhat a false question. Of course, they are working, they are functioning in many regards, but that's not enough. And that's not enough considering the kind of administration that we have at the federal level right now. And I would call this kind of administration much more movement government than properly a regular government or a regular administration. Of course, it has to do with the president's profile, the fact that, as Kristen had pointed out, he's a very combative leader, and also his allies, his ADs in the administration are also very conflicted. And so we have problems concerning the relationship with the subnational governments, with the Congress, even more with the Supreme Court. And so it produced much more noise than properly public policy, than properly important decisions in what regard managing the country and transforming the country and implementing important policies like, for this moment, the health policies that will be really urgent and necessary to face the problems that the pandemics caused to us. But it was even worse some time ago. And why that? Because Bolsonaro decided for 1.5 years since the beginning of his administration until the middle of the last year to not build a political coalition in the Congress. But finally, he decided to do that. He built a political coalition with the more traditional parties, the parties that can be deemed as adhesion parties, parties that provide support to any administration, doesn't matter exactly which is its program, since they receive something in return. And so it started to work better in terms of the capacity of the administration to pass the bills in the Congress. Before that, many important policies passed in the Congress despite of the executive branch and not because of it. And so I think this is an important point to stress. Now, the president has a more important political support at the Congress. But at the same time, I don't think that the government has a more complete, a more comprehensive policy agenda in terms of what he intends to implement. A part of that is an agenda that we say, well, like it was before the current Speaker of the House, Arthur Lira, during Rodrigo Maia's term. It was much more a congressional agenda in terms of economic reform that was a legacy from the period of Michel Temer's than properly an agenda that was enforced and carried on by this administration. And this is why I think many important things passed at that time. I'm not so optimistic that more infrastructural agenda will go forth right now. And I don't think that they will be so successful because we have perhaps two different kinds of policies that will be implemented right now. One economic policy has much more to do with the privatization of important sectors of the government or public concessions. In that time, we have perhaps a more specific track that can be filled with different measures than measures that require a lot of negotiation, a lot of bargaining in the Congress, like, for example, tax reform or even fiscal reform. I don't think that we have enough space for that. And at the same time, since the president produced so much noise, it makes things even more difficult in terms of taking decisions, in terms of bargaining, and even in terms of obtaining political support for the whole society, from sectors of the media, from subnational governments, and so on. I think this is one point in what regards the economic front. And besides that, we have another point that is raising right now. We have an inflationary perspective. We have now the highest level of inflation in the last few years. We are much over the limit of the inflation target. And so I think that we face severe problems in what regard that. This is the first point. The second point has to do with the relationship of this administration with the security forces, with security organizations of the Brazilian state. And here we have perhaps three different fronts. One front has to do with the military, much more the army at the federal level. What we see is a militarized government that is becoming even more militarized right now. And the president is being successful in terms of obtaining political adhesion of the leaders of the army and of other forces to his personal agenda. And this is really worrisome. I think this is the first point. The second point is that we have the federal police that is investigating the severe important problems of this administration, like the ones that were mentioned by Julia concerning the Minister of Environment, Ricardo Salles, that, well, face some risks of even being arrested, don't know exactly what's going to happen. And we have at the same time important investigations that are made by the federal police that target the president's family in what refers to, for example, the fake news investigation that is being conducted not only in the Congress, but also by the Supreme Court. And now we have very recent news that links the president even house his wife and his son directly to this investigation. So I think that we have a lot of turmoil coming from that. And the third point in what regards the security forces has to do with, and just to point one, to stress another point about the federal police, it shows that the federal police was not exactly abducted by this administration as it was feared by us a few months ago. And so we still have a considerable autonomy by the federal police. But the third point, the third security force that is involved in this situation are the state level military police. Not only the military, but much more the military police than the civil police at the state level in Brazil. And why that? Because they are very politicized. They are majoritarily supportive of Bolsonaro's agenda and Bolsonaro perspectives of politics. And we have a political climate now in Brazil that reinforces the decision of the opposition force to go to the streets and the decision of the policies at the state level to repress these demonstrations. We have seen something recently in Recife, but it was not at all the first case. And we have signals that it can continue for the next months. And so this is a very important point, a very important source of uncertainty in what regards the next steps. And just to finish, in what regards the sanitary conditions in Brazil right now, well, we really don't have perhaps a so bad situation like it could be, to consider a point that was raised by Chris. But I believe, again, despite the federal administration, and not because of that, it works properly because in the Brazilian Federation, state level administrations and municipal level administrations are majoritarily doing their jobs, not throughout the whole country, but in a considerable measure, they are doing their jobs. And so they implement, they enforce the sanitary policies that are necessary to detain the expansion of the pandemics, or to control minimally the situation. It's real that we have a reasonable level of vaccination in Brazil, but at the same time, we have to consider that Brazil perhaps had one of the best programs for immunization of its population in the world, not only in the developing world, but in the world in general. It just didn't work for 6 months. And why that? And so we are so late for this, because the measures that have to be done, they weren't. And so we face this situation right now. And so I think that we have to consider this relationship with the federal administration and the subnational government, because again, we have here another source of instability, another source of important political conflict that can, again, produce instability for the next period. That's my point for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Claudio. I think there's a lot within what the three of you have said to start that we'll want to discuss further during the Q&A. Just a reminder to those of you who are watching online, you can send us questions via email to brazil@wilsoncenter.org or tweet us @BrazilInst. Claudio, to follow up on your comments on the pandemic, I wonder if we could broaden it to talk about Congress and the congressional inquiry into the government's handling of the pandemic, not just what has been revealed, but what has been the impact of those discussions, of those conversations on the government.
Which conversation specifically do you mean? Sorry?
The parliamentary inquiry into the pandemic.
The parliamentary inquiry, okay. Yeah. Well, I think this is, again, another source of problems for the federal administration. First of all, because this is a kind of administration that uses a lot the narratives, perhaps much more than the policies properly. And so the appraisal that the population make about this administration has a lot to do with this kind of narratives. But the parliament inquiry, the Senate inquiry, they are providing, well, an alternative narrative about the facts. Not exactly the same alternative narratives that the big media was capable of provide, but a more official one, a more politicized one, in which you have a political element that allows some forces from the opposition and some forces that present themselves as independent from the administration, and they really are, but I believe that they are much more oppositors or perhaps mild oppositors of the administration, to present an alternative perspective of that. And it changes the political climate in the country. It affects the evaluation that people can make about Bolsonaro's performance during this period. And they can also provide not only a narrative, but also a formalization of what really happened in this country for the next year. And so, since it provides this alternative perspective in an official manner, it can not only provide the judicial institutions inside Brazil about that, but even it can cause some problems for this government in terms of how international organizations that deal with human rights issues can deal with this problem. Not only the president later, but not only some members of the administration later can be sent to be judged in international courts, but also they can affect how the Brazilian international relations will work for the next period, considering what this committee is capable of revealing and formalizing.
I weigh in here as well, Anya.
Go ahead.
No, well, first of all, it's just as Claudio says, we're very good friends going for a long way back. I won't reveal to the audience as to when we first started getting together. We'll reveal our respective ages, but no, I mean, what I would say on this front is, I agree with the thrust of what Claudio has just said about the importance of the narrative, the congressional investigation, and there will be spillover effects. But I would say, though, that the political repercussion of this congressional investigation, I think, will be much smaller than previous congressional investigations that had the potential to generate a crisis of governability. There's a saying in Brasilia which says that you know how a CPI or congressional parliamentary investigation starts, but you never know how it will end. It's a dangerous cycle many times for governments, because there's this notion that you begin an investigative trail, that you expose evidence or malfeasance that undermines the credibility of the government. It damages the president's or the executive's approval ratings. The entire political class is following this investigative trail. The press is covering it, and it could lead to, and everything paralyzes around this new scandal, right? I would argue that we don't have those elements for this congressional investigation, right? So the object of the investigation is, was there mismanagement of COVID-19 or not? I mean, I would say that if you look at the coverage in the press over the past 4 or 5 months, it's been an intense barrage of criticisms over the management of COVID, over the delays in sending oxygen to the crisis in Manaus, of not procuring vaccines, of not defending social isolation, of irresponsible defense of treatment of kind of, for chloroquine or other medicines that haven't been proven to be, at least demonstrated to be to end up working. And so really what I think that this congressional investigation is rehashing elements that have already been socialized in public opinion, right? So I don't think that it's really bringing anything new from a public opinion point of view. So I don't think that this is actually damaging the president's approval ratings, because the president's approval ratings already took a big hit from January all the way through April. So I think that the president's approval ratings are going to follow epidemiological facts on the ground. If we have a meaningful third wave over the next month or two, then the president will suffer again. If in fact, the third wave is small and subdued because the vaccines have already having an impact on everybody above 60, and as you pick up the pace of vaccinations for better vaccines, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, right? And then we're headed towards a kind of end of the pandemic second half of the year, the president's numbers will recover and the political class will follow accordingly. In other words, I think that this congressional investigation is much more providing the inputs for marketing tools and narratives for the 2022 election, but it's not really generating a crisis in Brasilia in the very near term. It's not paralyzing what Congress is doing. I mean, the Senate is going to approve the privatization of Eletrobras next week, probably, right? So it's not as if that reforms have stopped because of this thing. So I think it has a lot of headlines, but the near-term political repercussions, I think, are much more limited than you would appreciate reading the headlines. But I would just make that point to complement what Claudio said. And I would also say, Claudio, I agree with you fully that essentially a lot of your comments on your initial statements are the quality of Brazil's institutions suggests that the damage wasn't bigger because of it, right? We have a large federal system. State and local governments did lockdowns. It wasn't a federal policy. The governor of São Paulo procured an additional vaccine, right? So you can say that, the end outcome of the sanitary crisis wasn't worse because we have a government that's constrained by all these other institutions. And so maybe that partially explains. I agree with you, right? So the quality of the policy is one thing. I was kind of focusing more on the outcome that really wasn't as disastrous on a comparative basis in Latin America as you would get the impression kind of reading the headlines of the press. But I do agree with you on it could have been a lot better.
And Julia, Chris and Claudio both talked about, some of the challenges in coordination between the federal government, the lack of coordination really between the federal government and the states and the municipalities. We've seen, tensions as well between the administration and the courts, which I believe you mentioned in your opening remarks. How much has that shaped, the political environment right now and Brazil's response to the pandemic?
So I believe that in terms of the election first, next year's election, Lula has been working very much close to the states in order to try to fill this void that was that exists because of the way Bolsonaro was conducting the government with the states and municipalities in general. The other thing you asked me was, sorry?
Looking at some of the conflict between the administration and the courts, and whether, in some ways, whether the administration might run into legal issues. I mean, we've seen Ricardo Salles, is under investigation. There have been other contentious areas. So, are we likely to see that conflict continue? And how important is it that, the courts find a way to work with the government?
I think it will continue in a way, and I think it's good that the Supreme Court now is really taking this role to guarantee the checks and balances that we need in the country. So yeah, I don't think it's gonna disappear, especially approaching the elections and everything else. So I think that it's gonna be like it is now, or even much more conflictive than right now. But I don't believe at the same time, considering, for example, and this is something that all of us know. For example, the governor of São Paulo, João Dória, he's a key player in the political spectrum, and I think that it's gonna continue this fight between São Paulo state and the federal level, especially because he is very much interested in running as well. Although I don't believe that there's a space for a third way in this next elections, but he is a key political player, and this is not gonna finish.
Yeah, and on talking about the elections, I'm curious to know what the three of you think about Lula's return to politics, and how much pressure does that put on Bolsonaro right now? Obviously, looking at the election, that's going to be a significant factor. But even now, we've seen Lula campaigning against Bolsonaro, as you mentioned, Julia, speaking with other political actors at the state level and the national level. So what does that mean for Bolsonaro, and how is it going to shape his own actions? Claudio?
Well, I think that when Lula came back to the political scenario, it changed completely. First of all, because we didn't have until then a political competitor on the left wing of the political spectrum in Brazil that would be really competitive, that will really occupy this space. And Lula truly occupied the whole space in what regards the left. This is why right now the other left to the center candidate, Ciro Gomes, he's trying to differentiate himself. It's something that already started during the 2018 campaign in the second round. But right now, he's trying to differentiate himself from Lula. He's attacking Lula in a ruthless manner, and he's trying to conquer some voters from the center, even from the moderate right. I don't believe that he'll be successful in that, because his image in what regards this sector of the constituency is still of a left-wing politician. And so I don't think that it will be easy for him to occupy this space. What seems to me much more likely to occur is that we can have space for a perhaps moderate right-wing candidate, or a right to the center candidate that can occupy a space that can come from the erosion of Bolsonaro support. And then, depending on how much Bolsonaro will lose support until 2002, we can have this third way candidate viable. But if it doesn't occur, well, it's very likely that what we're going to have in 2022 is again a polarization between Lula and PT in this case, Lula right now, and Bolsonaro on the other side. Yeah,
I would agree with what Claudio says. I mean, I I guess that, where I would weigh in is, on the one hand, you have Lula occupying the entire space on the left, Ciro desperate to move to the center or to the right, with a very difficult challenge to be able to do that. And then the larger question is the president's base robust? Will it erode more to open the space for a third way candidate? And I don't think so, to be quite honest. I mean, on that issue, what I would just point to is look at the president's approval ratings at the height of the second wave of the pandemic. Okay, so for everybody who has been following Brazilian politics, very closely or who isn't in Brazil, in the middle of April, I mean, we were in a very dire situation from a public health point of view. You had ICU occupancies, between 90 and 100%. Many people who are getting sick from COVID couldn't get a kind of an ICU bed. It generated fear in a lot of these urban populations that if I'm getting sick, I can't be seen. There were supply shortages. The deaths were over 3,000, deaths on a daily basis, 7-day rolling average basis. People were heading into near panic, and the anger against the president was at an all-time high given his mismanagement of COVID. At the worst moment of COVID, 25% of the population evaluated the president being excellent good, and 35% of the population approved the president. So if you measure approval ratings on a binary scale, his approval ratings were at 35. On a 5-point scale, excellent, good, regular, bad, horrible, they were at 25. Okay, a president with 35% approval ratings isn't a weak president. Okay, Trump lost the election by a hair with 41% approval ratings. Okay, so you kind of look at me just from a public opinion point of view, and you say, all right, the vaccines we will have a rollout of vaccines by October. We're going to have a good chunk of the over 18-year-old population vaccinated. Fear in the pandemic will diminish. I mean, that's already the issue. Is whether we have a third wave before then. The economy will probably recover. The forecasts are going from 4 to 5% GDP growth, recovery this year, which is going back to where we were prior to the pandemic. Is nothing to write home about, but it's an improvement. I mean, so odds are that his numbers will recover, not diminish further, right? Looking at the next 10 months. If that's the case, we have a president with a very strong base of 25%. Lula has got a very strong base of the identification of the PT is around 25% as well. Lula gets more than that. We have 30% of the electorate that doesn't vote. Abstentions were 21% last year. 9% voted blank or null. So in a context where 30% don't vote, and you have two strong bases of a quarter of the population, I think very little room for a centrist candidate to emerge. To be honest, just because I guess I come at this viewing the president's base as reasonably robust. Then your question is, how will Bolsonaro react to the entry of Lula? I don't think the president is in panic mode, to be quite honest. That's not the sense I have speaking with folks in the presidential panels. I think that Lula wants Bolsonaro in the second round, and Bolsonaro wants Lula in the second round, because each of them have large vulnerabilities. Right? So against a centrist candidate, each of them will probably lose. Right? So I think that the president's strategy is to mobilize his base, have these motorcades on the weekends, and the left will have their rallies. It'll be a scenario of everyone trying to mobilize their respective base to drum up and get prepared for 2022. But I don't see the president getting into panic, wanting to spend irresponsibly in response to a Lula threat. I think it's more of a betting that the economy will recover. Let me feed my base with polarizing rhetoric, keep them, let's say active, and kind of bet on the fact that with the vaccine rollout and the pandemic ending, that the administration will be in a decent position in 2022. So I think it's not really panic mode, to be quite honest, for the administration. I think it's going to be a very, very tight election. If I had to bet today, gun to my head, who's going to win? I think it's close to 50-50, it's close to a coin flip. I would give an edge to Bolsonaro because, incumbents have advantages. There's structural advantages to an incumbent. Any president with over 40% approval rating usually wins on a comparative database that we have of over 300 elections worldwide. I think Bolsonaro is a weaker incumbent. He has higher negatives, so he probably needs his approval ratings to go higher than 40. But I think there's an underappreciation of Bolsonaro's strength. And when I speak with the PT folks, a sense I get in the PT camp is they share that appraisal. They don't think anybody in the center will emerge, and they're headed towards a very, very difficult campaign in 2022.
You mentioned the president's base, Chris, which obviously includes, a large portion of the military and the security forces. How has support for Bolsonaro changed within the military? Has there been, growing concerns within the military over the politicization of the institution? We have a question from our audience as well, asking about the exoneration of General Pazuello for political activity for his appearance with Bolsonaro and what that means for civil-military relations.
Yeah, real quick, and Julia and Claudio, if you guys want to weigh in. This is a concern. Claudio made reference to it in his opening statements. I mean, what I would say, I'm not sure if both of you agree, is that there is a lot of discomfort in the upper echelons of the military over being too closely associated with this administration, right? And so that was made clear when we had kind of the heads of the armed forces asking their resignation, earlier in the year. There is a discomfort that the president wants the military to proactively defend the administration politically, and they're resisted, such a move. Let's remember that Bolsonaro comes from the lower ranks of the military, so he never had the support of the upper ranks of the military in the presidential campaign. The upper echelon of the military only supported the candidate Bolsonaro probably around May in the election cycle. So he's not, he's seen more as a man of the people of the lower ranks of the military itself, not necessarily from the same echelon of the upper ranks of the military. I mean, I think that the decision, for all of you who haven't been followed, evidently the former Minister of Health, Pazuello, was, under investigation. He's been defending himself in the congressional hearing. He appeared in a public act next to the president, which is against the bylaws and legislation in Brazil that an active duty member of the military can't participate in a political act, and the military decided not to punish him. Clearly, I think that what happened is that, the head of the armed forces started to get fearful of generating another crisis with the president who didn't want him punished. So it was a tactical retreat. It is a negative precedent. The concern is that other members of the military now could feel, impelled to be able to make political acts without repercussions. So it's a negative repercussion. But I would say that, it is there are limits as to how much the president can push the military around. If we're in the extreme scenario, this is what everyone's worried about. Let's say Bolsonaro loses, will he not respect the outcome? Will he say that there was fraud? The military will not follow him. I'm more worried about the military police at the state level. That is where I'm worried about. Those guys you can't control. They're more loyal to the president. If you're going to have any kind of acts of violence, it will come from that cadre. So if we have a January 6th moment in Brazil, it'll come from the state military police, not the military forces. Military forces, I think, are more institutionalized. We can discuss the extent of the setback from an institutional point of view of not punishing Pazuello, but there are bounds as to how much that institutionality will be undermined, I would argue.
Julia, I saw you nodding.
Yeah. No, I fully agree with Chris. And actually, regarding the armed forces, I believe that they are in a damage mode control. In my opinion, they're just trying to keep things going, try to preserve the institution as a state institution, not a government institution, till the end of this term of Bolsonaro. So, and I fully agree with the difference between the armed forces and the military police and the states, which is really something that we have to track and see how things will play out, because there we really have a real risk of social unrest and a mayhem.
Claudio, would you like to add anything?
I don't think he had too much thing to add, because I fully agree with both. And I really believe that, like it was said, that the state police, mainly the military state police, are perhaps so today the main sources of political instability in Brazil, and they can provide Bolsonaro the main basis in what regards using violence to support him, using violence perhaps to not accept an undesired political outcome in the elections next year. And so I think this is really the main source. In what regards the military at the federal level, well, I think we have important divisions inside the forces and even more inside the army. We have some sectors of the army that truly support Bolsonaro, that were engaged in his campaign, even some members of the higher ranks, perhaps some retired members of the higher rank, more than probably people from the active service. But we have some division. We know that there was an uncomfortable situation that was expressed by members of the higher ranks of the army in Pazuello's affair. And well, but despite of that, the chief of the army was responsible for giving him a pardon. And now to protect the investigation about this case for 100 years. What's there? What is so secretive that is necessary to have such a protection in a situation? It shows how problematic and how divisive this is inside the army. And so I have some concerns with the army, but I have much more concerns with the state police. That besides that, they are more numerous, they are more trained. They are not only more trained, but they are trained in dealing with violence daily, in a daily basis, and not only episodically. And so I think that they have real conditions of creating severe problems for Brazilian democracy.
All three of you touched on, this concern that there could be violence in the lead up to the election or after it. Obviously, here in the US, we had January 6th. And we've seen, in other countries, protests and violence as well. Bolsonaro has already started to hint that he's concerned about the Brazilian election system. And we should just say there that Brazil has a very secure election system. And it's always been very quick to produce the results. But if Bolsonaro, I guess the question is, do you think Bolsonaro will try to follow President Trump if he loses and not conceding the election? And if so, what would happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, Bolsonaro is giving all the signals that he's going to follow in Trump's script. I mean, he is already laying out the case for fraud by arguing that you need to have a printed ballot to be able to verify allegations of fraud, and a criticism of the current kind of electronic voting system adopted in Brazil, which is, at least by any kind of international metric, seen as secure and safe. Any electronic voting system has failings in terms from an IT security point of view. Let's just look at the age that we're living today, of course, but on a comparative basis, it is a robust, tested, proven system. So the president is defending a change for a printed ballot, which is unlikely to occur. So if he loses, he already has the justification to challenge, the basis of the election results. So it is, I would say if the election is very close and he loses, some version of a challenge is likely. And what we're likely to have as well is pockets of the Brazilian electorate believing in the president, much like in the United States. There was close to half the Republican base believed there was fraud in the US election. And if you have that in Brazil with decentralized state military police forces who are very pro-Bolsonaro, that's where Claudio and Julia's concern rear their ugly head. You may have episodic acts of violence, from these pro-Bolsonaro forces. Now, what I would say, though, is that even if the January 6th version of Brazil would look uglier because of the state military forces, I would bet the end outcome is similar. Because if, former President Lula wins, the military will back the results. The courts will back the results. Congress will back results. The media will back the results. So that all the entire political establishment, I think, would endorse the outcome. I have a very hard time kind of believing that, let's say, basic democratic institutions will be undermined. What would happen is that we'll deal with the repercussions of a pocket of the electorate that doesn't believe in the outcome. And the Bolsonaro base is more mobilized, more vocal. And so the next administration would have to deal with that mobilized base that felt robbed, right? And that's unfortunate for the quality of democracy. And we don't, whenever you have a pocket of the population that doesn't believe in the rules, that reduces the quality of the democratic outcome. But I think that the institutions are strong enough that I'm not really worried about the basic rules of the democratic process in Brazil. In that regard, I think that Brazil would follow the United States. That's essentially what happened in the United States. Even though you had a segment of the population that didn't believe in the outcome, you know, it hasn't undermined the ability of Biden to govern, right? I think it'll be tougher for the next government in Brazil, given the social environment and all that. But I think broadly it would follow the same script.
Great. I want to turn
Tanya, if I may, just one
Go
point that I think it's important. Nothing to add to what Chris just said. I fully agree with him. But just to talk a little bit about the paper ballot, because this is something that everybody has been talking about, and it's important to say that if we have currently two special committees in Congress discussing different issues related to the electoral system we have in Brazil. One of the topics is the paper ballot, but in order to have this applied to the elections next year, we would have to have something voted on by this October, which is very unlikely to happen. So it's much more political noise than something that can really happen and change for next year's election.
That's really helpful context. Speaking of Congress, I wanted to turn to the role of Congress and its strength relative to the presidency. We certainly saw under Rodrigo Maia, who was Speaker of the House, Congress taking on a more active role, in essence, pursuing a congressional agenda. Has that changed under Arthur Lira? Are we seeing, a different sort of relationship between Congress and the presidency, and how much influence does Congress have over policymaking in Brazil right now?
Well, I think that we have a much more aligned Congress, at least the House, with the president than used to have before, not in terms of the economic agenda, for example. In that regard, I don't think that we have a real change, but in terms of a general political support. And but I think that this is much more the consequence of the building of a political coalition since the last year than properly something that is created by the behavior of this new speaker. This new speaker is much more the consequence than the cause of such a situation. And so the president is much more comfortable in terms of, for example, don't have faced the risk of an impeachment process or having blocked some of his initiatives in this regard, is even in terms of the social behavior issues, in terms of environmental issues, in terms of education policies, some elements that were not supported by Rodrigo Maia before him. But in terms of economic policy, you don't have a real change. In terms of the other policies and the political support in general, it's completely changed.
I would also say that what's interesting about this Congress, and I would kind of argue that when we look at this Congress and the relationship with the executive, it's going to provide a plate full of data for political scientists to be able to study over subsequent years. And why? Because this is an administration, as Claudio reminded us, that didn't even try to construct a congressional coalition for the first year and a half of the mandate, right? So that you look at the president's party, he didn't distribute any positions in the cabinet, and despite that, was able to get a pension reform approved. The president got into trouble in COVID, got worried about his mandate, and he made a tactical retreat by negotiating with these centrist parties that Claudio talked about. Absolutely, which represents the bloc of Arthur Lira, the Speaker of the lower house. But even if you count up all the parties that negotiate support with the president, they don't have a majority of the lower house, and much less in the Senate. So this is a minority government, right, managing in Congress. And even with a minority coalition, there's this really interesting support for economic reforms. All right. So, and when I talk to party leaders in the lower house, I talk to party leaders in the Senate, they describe themselves as a reformist Congress. It's really interesting, right? So there's something about the political class emerging out of the 2016 economic crisis that led to the impeachment of Dilma and then the 2018 election. The sense I have talking with party leaders is that there was this tremendous shock of anger. The floor came out from under them. They had to rethink their electoral survival strategies, and it led to an equilibrium more favorable to reforms, even with the government not managing a majority coalition. And a lot of people in Brazil were saying, oh, it's Rodrigo Maia, the former House Speaker, he's the one that delivered pension reform. He's the one that negotiated all this. Well, he's gone, and the same environment continues with Lula. So it just goes to show that the reform impetus of the first kind of 2 years of the government was not just driven by one leader of Rodrigo Maia. It was actually a reform consensus that is underlying the party leadership, and we're still seeing signs of this, right? So that's kind of like, so I think that we, like as political scientists, we need to better understand this phenomenon, I would argue, and not focus only on what the executive is doing. And it's just, and so that's really kind of an interesting reform window, which really is a contrast with the rest of the region. That's why I would say, like, how do you approve central bank autonomy, gas reform law, a modest fiscal reform, privatization of electrobus this year, right? It's like, it says something about Congress, and that's something new. So I would just kind of call attention to that phenomena, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And I think we need to better understand the electoral incentives that are going on right now in the Brazilian Congress.
And looking at Bolsonaro's cabinet and talking about, finance reform, structural reform, there have always been rumors that Paulo Guedes will leave the administration. We've been hearing this for the last, 2.5 years. Does it seem likely that he's going to stick it out?
I don't believe so. That's all I have to say. I don't think at this point he's gonna leave, although something, and in politics, everything can happen. So, but at this point, I don't see he's leaving for any reason, although the president decides that.
It seems to me that Guedes in some ways has a smaller role now in terms of directing the reform agenda and some of the economic policies. Would you agree? To anyone who'd like to take that.
I think he's come out with a lot of scars over this past year. This is, the way that I would characterize, his relationship with the president is, we were dealing with an unprecedented public health crisis. The goalposts for what is considered responsible fiscal management were thrown out the window, right? So everybody last year was trying to figure out what's the adequate response, right? How much should we be spending given a certain level of debt burden? And so, the first response was easy. We'll throw a lot of money. We spent close to 6% of GDP, auxiliary benefit. The main difficult decisions were how do we get ourselves out of this emergency stipend that went to 41% of households in Brazil. And that's where the debates were occurring at the end of last year. Minister Guedes, well, we have to go cold turkey, retract all the benefits in January. Other elements of the administration were saying, no, that's too austere. Guedes is too conservative. Look at what's going on. And look what the European governments are doing. This is a prisoner to the old dogmas. And then the president he listened to both sides. He didn't fully trust Guedes. He would kind of have trial balloons of proposals. Markets would react. Guedes would risk his resignation. Then the president would retract and say, "No, Mr. Guedes, I'll respect your red line." He did that a couple times, right? So there are a couple of moments where Guedes almost left the administration. So I think that Guedes lost credibility. He managed this situation poorly in a number of these instances. His credibility in Congress diminished clearly. When you speak with party leaders, they felt it. But I think that the view in the economic team is that the worst has passed, that as the vaccination picks up, that we're able to survive this storm. And then Guedes looks at the reform and this, the congressional reform environment. He's like, oh, there's actually room for me to get some stuff done. So I think that he's come out smaller, yes, but I wouldn't underappreciate the perception that he has room to run and get some things done. And I think that ultimately it's like, well, if I deliver this in the first mandate and Bolsonaro wins re-election, my work can continue. It clearly is not the ambition that he had early, right? So, but those were completely unrealistic ambitions over what he could get done and transform Brazil. That I think is, I think that he just had to come down to reality. And then the politics of a completely unprecedented global health shock that threw out the window the script of how to manage fiscal policy in that environment. And that's just intrinsically difficult, right? And for a president who wasn't committed to the economic reform agenda or liberal agenda, the president was testing those limits repeatedly. But so smaller, but still quite relevant, I would kind of conclude.
Thanks, Chris. And I'd love to ask the three of you a question about the environment and Brazil's relationship with the United States. Obviously, President Joe Biden here in the US is very focused on climate change and working with Brazil to curb deforestation in the Amazon. How receptive do you think the Bolsonaro government is? How interested are they in sitting down at the table with the US and having concrete conversations about ways to tackle deforestation? Easy question, I can tell.
I don't think that they have a real interest. Sorry, Julia, please go on.
No, go ahead, please.
Okay. I don't think that they have a real political interest in that. The policy that has been, if we can call that exactly a policy, but the policy that's being implemented in environmental issue in Brazil, this is what this government really wants. This is why Salles is such a strong minister, despite of what can really happen. And of course, if the Brazilian government is forced to a negotiation in face of, for example, some sanctions, economic sanctions or other kind of sanctions at the international level, well, they can go to the table and to negotiate something. But perhaps much more to give some satisfaction about that than properly to really change their perception, their conception, or even the concrete policies in what regards that. Even because some groups of interest that have the interest of deforesting to expand the frontier of soy plantations, of cattle raising, or even of wood collection. Well, these guys, they are supporters of this administration, or even the gold miners, they are supporters of this administration. They are the organic basis in terms of social economic basis. And so it's part of this administration to do what they are doing. And so they only go to the table if are really forced to do that. In spite of that, they won't.
No. I would give a, I share Claudio's concerns that capacity of the administration to curb illegal deforestation on the ground and willingness to take very difficult steps, I think you can certainly question that. But I would say that at least the sense I get is, we have to keep attuned to how economic stakeholders are reacting to the cost that Brazil is paying for being seen as a villain on the international stage on environmental issues. And so the agricultural lobby is very worried about that because they're worried that Brazilian agricultural experts could be punished if they're not seen as associated with a government that is not compliant with kind of the environmental agenda. Brazil's kind of business associations are also concerned on that front. You look at so stakeholders kind of representing, pushing the Ministry of Agriculture on the one hand, you look at kind of the President of the Central Bank on the other, also very much concerned about the reputational hit that Brazil can take. And I would even say that in the Ministry of the Environment of Ricardo Salles, that there is a view that if you're able to regulate Article 6 of the Paris Climate Agreement, and you come to an agreement in Glasgow, that in a regulated carbon credit market, Brazil could really get a lot of resources on say environmental preservation or the carbon credit market more specifically. So I do think that there's a bit of a shift going on in the administration. And I think that the president's statements at the summit in Washington is indicative of that pressure, that they're starting to see an upside to working with the Biden administration. The bilateral negotiations between Brazil and the US have been going well. I don't think the Biden administration wants to punish Brazil right away. They want to use the carrot to be able to bring them to the part of an international coalition to come to agreement in the Paris climate negotiations in Glasgow in November. And I think the Brazil administration is willing to play that game when they see an upside. The Achilles heel is, are you doing enough to take care of business and avoid deforestation in the Amazon? And in the upcoming dry season, are we going to get an improvement? And the data for the last 2 months doesn't look good, right? So if you have headlines of a worst fire season, when you're trying to negotiate a deal in Glasgow, that's where, you know, I think you could that you could have some problems. But I wouldn't. I just wouldn't say that this is an immovable target. I think that there are actors pushing to shift it. I think the president is starting to curb a bit, but the real issue is, you know, what can you do from a command and control point of view to stop these fires and prevent the clearings? And the role of the military has not worked, right? There's a huge discomfort over the role of IBAMA, ICMBio. They demobilized the command and control structure that was previously. It incented, you know, bad behavior on the ground, and you're dealing with a big problem right now.
The U.S. is the second largest trade partner of Brazil, so there's no other way to deal with it. They need to continue engaging with the country. And actually, the new Foreign Affairs Minister, França, he has been very close to the administration here and talking with the USTR and other important bodies. So of course, we still need to have concrete things to show to the Biden administration and to show that Brazil is really fighting deforestation, illegal deforestation. But so far, I think that the engagement has been continuing.
And speaking of the longevity of ministers, will Ricardo Salles stay on, do you think? Or could these investigations potentially be too much?
I don't think that this is the only reason, the investigation. I think that the drought season can change this scenario because, as Chris just said, the numbers of fires, we just hit another record, and it's the trend is to have a worse scenario than the one that we have now. So I think that there are a lot of factors. I don't think that this is something that Bolsonaro would like to do, but especially because it's an important ally for him in the ideological spectrum for the next election. But depending on other factors, it's going to be unbearable to keep him in the administration.
Thank you. So we have 10 to 15 minutes left. And to close, I'd like to just ask all of you to share with us, you know, what are you going to be watching in the next couple of weeks and months? You know, what are the key things in the administration or Brazil as a whole that you think we should all be paying attention to? Chris, I'm gonna start with you.
Okay. Well, I would say, you know, we're all talking about politics in terms of the Brazil story and the environment, but I would actually think that there are two things that could upset the current equilibrium. One is epidemiological, and the second one is hydro. Because, you know, I think the biggest question in the next 2 months is, are we going to have a third wave or not? How severe? Before the benefits of the vaccine. We tend to land on the fact that, you know, you look at kind of, you know, the pace of hospitalizations, how the hospitalizations is declining of everyone above 60. Seems this is just that vaccines are having an impact already on those above 60. I'm a little bit less worried about a third wave than I was a month ago, but that's a big, big question mark. The second is, you know, Brazil set up for economic recovery, but it could face a power crisis because the water reservoir levels are extraordinarily low. The government is trying to turn on thermal power plants to be able to avoid rolling blackouts. But that is a meaningful risk. If rains don't come in November, we will have some version of a blackout. So I think that's something that could hurt Bolsonaro ahead of 2022 if you have a power crisis. And then I would say that that's this year that I would be looking at in terms of changing the pattern of where we're coming out of COVID. And then I would just say that for 2022, it's just, we're going to have to, in this clash of the titans between Lula and Bolsonaro, I think that there's going to be a lot of debate and questions and anxiety over what a new Lula administration would represent, right? And I'll just say that the potential for financial markets to get freaked out over the return of Lula is high, particularly in the context where we have a very high debt burden coming out of COVID. And so the requisites of balancing fiscal accounts are tougher. There will be a lot of exaggerated perception of risk. I think Lula is an inherently pragmatic politician. He is negotiating with the political center. I don't think he'll do crazy, irresponsible fiscal policies if elected, but I think that there will be a lot of focus on reading the tea leaves over what his government will represent on fiscal management, on kind of, economic management more broadly in terms of, state-owned utility, state-owned enterprises, and so I think that's going to, let's say, anticipating what a Lula risk is and what a second Bolsonaro term would look like, right? That's going to be the big debate. If we were to do this panel in 8 months, I think that's all we would be talking about, all right? How we anticipate each of these and, how can Brazil, what does that mean for Brazil's growth going forward, right? I would say that I would just end by saying that there's a usual pattern of kind of pundits and comments in the press and perceptions of risk. There's always overshooting. There's always, right? That either people get way excited about Brazil or way pessimistic about Brazil, but there seems to be kind of a, an institutional framework that things are never as bad as they seem and they're never as good as that people hope, right? And I think that's kind of a pattern of Brazilian politics, right? And I think it will probably apply to this election and the post-election outcome more specifically. But those are I would say the three things I'm looking at.
Thanks, Chris. We'll have to invite all of you back next year to have a conversation about the election itself. Julia, I'm going to turn to you next. Your thoughts on what we all should be watching.
Yeah, I agree with Chris. Of course, the election is one of the topics, and it's very important because it means the future of the country in the next 5 years. And the third wave of COVID, of course, because this is by far the most important thing. And I think it's a real risk. And then we should look at this too. And another point I will add is how will be the social programs of the government, because as I mentioned earlier, we have a dire situation in Brazil, considering the poor and the situation of people right now. So what kind of programs we're gonna have to balance this terrible situation we have today, and in what will be the shape of each one of those programs that, by the way, Guedes was mentioning earlier today and yesterday as well. So I would mention those three topics.
Thank you, Julia. And Claudio, what do you think? What should we all be paying attention to?
Wow, it's difficult to add something else after Julia and Christopher. Well, I think that we really have this discussion for the next month, not only about what could expect for the two different, more likely to happen scenarios for the next period, but also on how can we, for the next period, also rebuild a considerable part of the Brazilian state that was, at least at the federal level, dismantled during this period. Bolsonaro himself said when he was in the US for the first time that he came to deconstruct to destroy, and only after that it will be possible to build. And now what we're facing is that in many areas of the public policies and of the public institutions at the federal level, we have a real dismantling. And I think this will be a real problem for the next government. It doesn't matter who will be the next president. Now, if it's Bolsonaro, okay, it's a continuation of the same thing. If it's another one, either Lula or something else, well, this person will have a real burden in terms of rebuilding everything, in terms of making the federal administration functional again, not only in the collecting area, not only in the treasury, but I mean in the social areas. Julia mentioned that. I think that the problem in terms of social policy is not only the continuity of the policies that we already had, but also the bureaucracy, how it works. Where are these people? How they were treated? Are they still functional in terms of the capacity of implementing the former policies that were already there when this new government arrived? I think this is an important problem for the discussions during the next months.
Thank you, Claudio, and thank you to all of our panelists, Julia Esmanioto from Patri, Chris Garman, Eurasia Group, Claudio Couto from the Fundação Getúlio Vargas. It's been a real pleasure to have this conversation with you, and we are incredibly grateful that you've joined us today to share your expertise and explain a little bit of what has been going on in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.